We have a quorum, so let's call to order the September 6th Planning Commission meeting in Brattleboro. I think announcements were not on the agenda, but that was just a mistake. So I didn't catch that either, but let's do them. Sue, could you just, I know I've asked you this and you have the answer for me, but regarding the Better Connections grant, as well as the, we talked about the state's model housing project.
Sure. Yes, so the town was notified that we received a Better Connections grant. We're going to do a study on the Canal Street corridor. We actually haven't gotten that grant agreement from VIII. They're a bit delayed. This on the select board agenda for tomorrow night. Actually, they're going to be hopefully accepting the grant. I am working on a request for proposal, but that'll probably go out this month, even if it's in advance of the grant agreement, as long as the select board accepts it. So we'll have more to talk about probably in October.
Okay, great.
And then we did submit an application. The state is doing a, what is it called? They're kind of doing, they're trying to do some designs for missing middle housing. We had submitted an application to be one of the communities that would be involved in that project. We were not selected. So.
But we had a commissioner or two, or maybe all of us, to some degree, were interested, at least somewhat, or in us doing that. Like that was one of the projects in the running several months ago that we were considering. And so I think it'd be good just to keep, I think we expressed that we wanted to stay updated. I mean, we could probably all find that info ourselves, but if you could be our conduit for how that state's project is going along, going forward, thank you. And I received an email, I think all board or committee or commission chairs received an email from Patrick Moreland, our assistant town manager, on behalf of the Charter Revision Commission. And that was because they are planning in their November meeting, if they're having one or two meetings in November, I don't know, but sometime in November, just to get formal opinions or feedback or ideas from committees about anything that is, I guess, in their purview relating to the charter. Because if you all don't know, they're going through a review and potential revision process of our town charter. So I think on the October agenda we'll have a space for that, and I hope everyone, looks at the charter and sees, to whatever extent they think the Planning Commission, has input on that. Then yeah, feel free to contact us and ask questions too, leading up to that. Are there any other announcements from anyone? I'm seeing none. I think there's some members of the public here, so I'll just say for them that we have a formal public comment period at the very end of the meeting. If someone wanted to say something sooner, we could move it up, but if it's applicable to one of the three substantive agenda items, you can speak during those agenda items as well. Just raise your hand, or if I don't see that, yell. But then there will be the public comment period at the end for any other topic whatsoever. Let's move on to the minutes. We didn't have an August meeting, so this is the July 5th minutes. I'll entertain a motion, and then we can do any discussion that need happen.
I'll move to accept the minutes as written.
Okay, is there a second? I'll second it. Great. Any issues or questions? Anything at all with the minutes? Okay. All those in favor, please raise your hand and keep it raised. So we kind of have to do a roll call. That's myself, Dan, Lindsay.
I just have a question. I wasn't there, so I'm abstaining. Is that?
I think that's okay. Minutes don't actually need a vote, right? It's just something we always do.
I have heard that.
You have heard that, yeah?
I have heard that. I know other boards, not municipal boards, but I know other nonprofit boards that
They were helpful for catching up. So from that standpoint, I approve them. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you can always say that you watched or if you watched the video, then you're just as...
In the past, we've had people who haven't been there vote in favor.
Okay. Great. Okay, moving on to the considering our bike parking standards. A former planning commissioner, Prudence McKenney, who's actually here in person in the audience, connected, well, she's with BCAT, the Brattleboro Coalition for Active Transportation, and they work with or have been communicating with Jonathan Weber of an organization called Local Motion. I think it's Vermont is their purview. Maybe they do more than Vermont, but he can speak to that. And Jonathan has some ideas. If we like what he presents and we think it brings up a worthwhile avenue to pursue, then he's, I think, offered to show up to multiple meetings and draft, potential language for our land use regs and incorporate, or take into account our feedback and adjust them. And he will also be kind of a conduit to BCAT for us. Unless I missed anything, I think I'll just pass it over to Jonathan, and he can begin.
Jonathan, would you like me to share the presentation, or would you like to share it?
I'm happy to do it if you want to pass me the screen sharing.
Okay.
Yeah, so Jonathan, welcome, and Prudence, thanks for connecting us, and thanks for giving your free labor to potentially improve our land use regs and our town and advance active transportation.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Muskowski, and thanks to all the other commissioners for having me here tonight, and to Sue for help with this. So it's not free labor. I work for Local Motion, and we actually have funding to do this kind of technical assistance work for communities all throughout the state through our Complete Streets program, which I manage. So my work is really focused on improving policy and walk-bike infrastructure at the local level and at the state level. That includes working with local groups of folks like the Brattleboro Coalition for Active Transportation, who advocate and advise their municipalities on how to get more folks out walking, biking, and rolling safely. So Local Motion is a statewide organization. We do a lot of other things aside from technical assistance. We also run a bike ferry up in the Champlain Islands that some of you may be familiar with. We run education programs at schools. We set up e-bike lending libraries, including the one that's operating now in Brattleboro. So lots of work, all sort of aimed at getting more folks out walking and biking and rolling. So tonight, here to chat about bike parking regulations and how they function within development ordinance or development regulations. We can jump right in. So the presentation is sort of going to be structured this way. First, I'm going to give an overview just generally of bike parking regulations, how they typically are structured in ordinance or in land use regulations. I'm going to talk about what's in Brattleboro's current land use regulations. And then we'll talk about some possible updates that you might consider. So just generally, like most things in land use regs, they typically only apply to new developments and changes to existing developments. They are part of the city's comprehensive development regulations. They do not affect existing developments or existing bike parking, but they can sort of be viewed as the city's standard for design of bike parking and help businesses throughout town sort of think about, okay, if I were to change my development, would this get approved today, this bike rack that I have out front? Typically included, you've got a statement of intent, describing why the regulation exists. And this can also help if there are questions down the road or issues that aren't clearly defined in the ordinance to sort of think about, well, what was the intent here and how do we apply that in this decision point? Applicability really defines when and where the bike parking regulation applies. So for what uses or in what zoning areas. Requirements basically state, how much bike parking, so how much short term, how much long term. And then design standards really dictate, what rack types are conforming and how far should the racks be set from a wall, from each other, from the street, all that stuff to ensure that the bike parking is really well designed and usable. And then sometimes you get some miscellaneous elements, which we can talk about as well. So in terms of what Brattleboro has in its current land use regulation, there's nothing really around intent. For applicability, it really only applies to projects in specific districts, specific zoning districts, and only if a major site plan review is required. So that's pretty clearly defined and fairly narrow. In terms of requirements, quantities are not really specified beyond generally that racks should accommodate 2 bikes. And there's no long-term bike parking or amenities required, with one exception, which we'll get into in a minute. Again, for design, there's really not much, except for racks should hold 2 bikes, and they should support the bike in 2 places. And we'll talk about that more as well. So again, bike parking requirements only apply to projects that require a major site plan review. Which you all probably know what that means, but there's the list. And they only apply in these zoning districts on the left side: urban center, village center, service center, neighborhood center, and the waterfront. So if you're in any of the districts on the right, if your project's in any of the districts on the right, no bike parking is required, regardless of whether or not there's a major site plan review. So let's say you are undergoing a major site plan review and you are in one of the districts on the left side. So you need to build bike parking. What exactly do you need to build? The ordinance right now basically just says a bicycle rack must be provided within 200 feet of each entryway, and public bike racks can count towards the requirement, and a single rack can serve multiple entrances. So there's sort of a list of where all of that is in the ordinance. The one exception that I mentioned to long-term bike parking is that it is required for single room occupancy facilities. So you've got to have at least one secure enclosed bike storage space for every 2 units. But that's really the only provision related to long-term bike parking, which is typically indoor or enclosed bike parking that's only accessible by, residents or tenants of that development. Again, in terms of sort of the design standards required in the current regulations, there's the 200 feet of a building entrance requirement. It suggests that they should be covered whenever feasible. Probably that's not happening much. And then in terms of the design of the bike rack, it says it needs to be a metal frame securely anchored to the ground that's designed to accommodate at least 2 bicycles and support the bike horizontally in at least 2 places, and allow the bicycles to be locked to the frame with standard user supplied locks. So it's a pretty basic description of what a bike rack should be. It's not uncommon to see this kind of description relied upon in ordinance, but it can pretty easily fall short in terms of ensuring that racks are built to a high quality. It does allow sort of what we call wheel bender racks, which are pictured in the 2 photos on the left. Essentially, if you're only requiring parking for 2 bikes, that means that people could use the ends of the rack, and that would support the bike horizontally in 2 places. Sort of how this person has done it, but if they were pulled up more against this support here, that would satisfy the ordinance. So the problem with these wheel bender racks is once those 2 end spaces are filled, it's very difficult to lock a bike securely to them, because you basically push the wheel in between these vertical bars, and then it's very difficult to get the lock close enough to the rack itself to actually lock the frame of the bike. So a lot of people wind up locking their bicycle very insecurely to these, which can result in higher rates of theft, which is obviously not something we want. And then on the right, you can also wind up with some kind of funky like art racks, which they're fun, but they're often not a very efficient use of space. This one pictured here, you're probably only going to park like 2 or 3 bikes on that rack. And if you were to use a better design of rack in that space, you could probably get, 4, maybe 6 bikes parked there. So looking at some possible updates, intent is, as I said, it's good to express for, those hard decisions that come down where you're not sure how to apply the ordinance. It's not, I would say, the most important thing to include in your regulation, but here's some language of what that might look like. Talking about, encouraging the use of the bicycle, meet the demand of the property, reduce hazards from bikes that are parked to objects that weren't intended to be used as bike racks. I think applicability is one of the 2 probably major things that would be most impactful to update in the ordinance. The provision that makes bike parking regulations only apply to projects that require a major site plan review is fine. I think that's, that seems totally appropriate if you want to have better bike parking. What's more problematic in my mind, if you want to ensure that all the developments that should have bike parking have it, is the sort of that's based in zoning districts. What most more comprehensive bike parking regulations will do is they'll apply to all zoning districts, but only to certain uses. And the amount of bike parking required for any given use is different, which is basically how Brattleboro treats car parking. So this is what the car parking requirements look like. It's not about zoning district, it's just about where the use is happening and the scale of the use. So that could be square footage, it could be capacity, it could be number of students in a school. But people are likely to be riding bikes everywhere throughout the city. They're not thinking about which zoning district they're going to, where their destinations are. It's just about getting from A to B and being able to walk your bike securely wherever you're going. So in addition to probably rethinking about that zoning district orientation and going more to an orientation of bike parking requirements defined on use, I would also encourage you to think about some design standards to ensure that the bike parking that does get built is really usable and space efficient. So these are some graphics that Local Motion has made that I think are great to include in an ordinance, so that it's really easy for reviewers to know if what's being proposed meets the standard. It's easy for developers to understand what they should be building, how far racks should be placed from the street, and also which types of racks are actually conforming to the standard to ensure that you're not getting a lot of wheel benders built. And then finally, some miscellaneous elements. You obviously don't want to, have bike parking be a real hindrance to development. So you do want to have provisions for waivers. Some municipalities will require a payment in lieu if the developer can't build the bike parking that would have been required. You can think about allowing the bike parking to be provided in the public right of way. You could think about, how staff can adjust or reduce bike parking requirements when it's justifiable. Another thing some municipalities are incorporating is transportation demand management in their regulations, basically provisions that encourage development elements that discourage use of cars for driving. So that could look like, when a developer builds their project, if they want to have less car parking, you can encourage that by, asking them to, okay, you can, reduce your car parking by 5 spaces if you put a shelter over your short-term bike parking to encourage more use by bike instead of driving your car. So that is my last slide. I know that was a lot of information to throw at you, and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I'm thinking we start with questions, like Jonathan invited, before we move on to, giving direction or stating maybe our preferences for moving forward. Questions from commissioners or the public? clarifications?
I have one.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Jonathan, since you're working across the state, if there are any places that you would point to as doing bike parking really well. Who's got it dialed in right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a work in progress everywhere, but certainly if you look at Burlington, South Burlington, Williston, more of the Chittenden County towns in the core, a lot of them have updated their bike parking ordinances in the last 5 or so years. And the developments that have gone in do have much better bike parking that's meeting demand both for like short-term visitors and for folks that are visiting long-term. All of those ordinances, I believe, are based in use rather than zoning district. So even in their areas that are zoned industrial, they acknowledge that folks are likely to work, bike to their job at that warehouse or at that processing facility, and bike parking should be provided there as well.
Yes, Prudence in the audience here. I think you should come up.
So I want to thank the commission for taking the time on this issue, and I guess as someone who rides their bike around Brattleboro, I would love it if the commissioners could consider also the visibility of the rack. 200 feet's pretty far, and you could, ideally when you're riding somewhere, you want to ride up to your destination and see, where you're going to park your bike, just like you would if you were driving your car. And so if I don't know what the language should say, but something like as visible as possible, no further than, or something like that. That is one thing that would be, I think, really helpful.
I'll chime in on that too, just to say that there have been a couple places I've lived where bike parking was kind of color coded to something else that was a color significant aspect of town, like all the lampposts or garbage cans or bike racks, like everything kind of went together, and it gave you a visual cue to look for. So one place it was this kind of like royal blue, that gave you something to look for. So I don't know if there's, if we want to match our lampposts or something, but that could be a way to do it. I think the visibility is an important piece of it, so people know where to find bike racks. I think I've got them pretty well mapped at this point, but anybody who isn't used to biking in Brattleboro, it'll take them a little while to find them all.
Thank you.
Okay. Any questions from staff about Mr. Weber's analysis or? Okay.
I would say seeing it laid out that way is just interesting, and looking at the zoning districts and yeah.
Right. I have a question regarding the two styles of rack types that Jonathan, that you well, maybe this isn't your official recommendation or anything, but in that figure there's 5 or so non-recommended ones and 2 that are recommended. Are those what sort of connection do those have to the ground? Because it seems to me, maybe there's long threaded bolts that were threaded rods connected to concrete, deep down. But if it's just some screwed, I guess it could be done either way. But have you seen that people can just kick those and then they are loose from the ground, and then a bike could just be I guess not in the case of the circular one, because it would still be attached to there, but in the case of the 3-sided rectangle, it could just be pulled out.
Yeah, so there's a whole variety of mounting options for bike racks. Some are surface mounted, so you basically drill a hole and then tap in a threaded rod that expands as you tighten the rack to it.
Right.
And so those are just secured to the ground with like a nut, and if someone wanted to, they could loosen it and take the rack off. That's not something that's common. There is tamper resistant hardware that can replace those nuts if that's a concern. Some developers do an in-ground mount where you either place the rack in the concrete as it's curing, or actually after the fact bore a hole into the concrete and then use a construction epoxy to secure it in place. So there's a whole variety of ways that they can mount. Generally speaking, bike theft is a crime of opportunity. Someone who's looking for a bike to steal sees one that is locked insecurely or not at all, or just with a cable lock that's really easy to cut. And they're typically not plotting or approaching racks with tools. In bigger cities, there is it's more common to see racks actually like getting cut. Oftentimes, the best way to address that is to use square tubing rather than circular tubing. Since it can't be cut with a pipe cutter, you have to use a power tool if the tubing is square. And that is something that could certainly be outlined in an ordinance if that was important. But generally, in Vermont communities, the bikes that get stolen are poorly locked. And so one of the best things that municipalities can do is provide racks that are easy and intuitive to lock securely to.
Okay, that's good to know that that's not a frequent occurrence. So I mean, it wouldn't seem to me to be necessary to require a greater expense or burden if something's not something's really, really rare. I see Dan's hand up.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Jonathan, I'm just curious if you could comment on the installation expenses and the possibly the improvement to the value of the property once these are installed. General numbers.
Yeah.
Any scenario you might choose, just kind of a round ballpark numbers.
Sure. For a hoop rack or sort of this inverted U rack style that you see on the left here, those are around $200 each. And then there's typically a volume discount. The installation is pretty straightforward. If you're doing a surface mount, it's probably 20 minutes per rack once you're there. So the cost, the marginal cost to install good bike parking is really not much higher than the cost to install bad bike parking. Bike rooms, when you start talking about longer term bike parking, that does get more expensive. You're using part of the inside of the building that could potentially be used for other purposes. But in my mind, it does make the property much more attractive, especially for folks who want to own an e-bike. And especially if you're talking about an apartment building where units are on floors above the ground floor that are really hard to get an e-bike into. Since if there's no bike room in that building and I own an e-bike and my apartment's on the 3rd floor, I'm not going to lock it outside. So I'm probably not going to be very interested in an apartment there if there's no bike room that I can store it in.
Fair enough, but would you say there's a sort of a return on investment argument to be made with a apartment building owner, or let's say an SRO building in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially for an SRO, a lot of those folks are there because it's affordable, and we know that bicycling is a really popular way to get around for lower income folks. So having that secure bike parking is going to make it more appealing for folks to rent there. So I definitely think it's a great return on investment for property owners in terms of the value of the units that they're going to be selling or renting. They can talk about good secure bike parking.
Yeah, I had a question, Jonathan. How do you define short-term, and is long-term residential? Is long-term for employees? How do you define each?
Yeah, so typically in ordinance, it's defined more by characteristics than it is intent. So long-term bike parking is basically located in an enclosed, secure facility that's accessible by the tenants of that building. And the intention is that it's for, basically any stops over a couple hours. Yeah, did I answer the question, Sue?
It does, thank you.
Well, maybe, how about an informal straw poll amongst the 4 commissioners to see, do we like this and want to move forward? That'd be thumbs up, or do we have concerns and want to put the brakes, or, yeah. Thoughts? Does that sound good? Like the straw poll? Yeah, thumbs up, thumbs up. Dan, what's your thought?
I have a kind of just something to think about in terms of space allocation. I know we have tree requirements, for example, streetscape trees, and this obviously takes up space. We can talk about the details, but I guess I'm just thinking, that's something that we'd have to wrestle with in terms of space, in terms of allocation of space particularly on small properties. That's just a thought, though. And I Jonathan, if you have any comment about that, I'm just curious. I mean, if that comes into play when you're talking with folks about it.
Yeah, I mean, bike parking does certainly take up space, and tree cover is super important for traffic calming and walkability and a whole host of other things. There are a lot of ways, and I think it's a really good idea to build in staff discretion for the amount of bike parking required, and also allow for developers to potentially have that payment in lieu option if it's really not something that can be accommodated on their property in a reasonable way. So yeah, you don't want to be setting up trade-offs that you don't want. And there are absolutely ways to ensure that the ordinance is written in a way that you don't.
Okay. Yeah, so I brought up the straw poll just to gauge the interest and to propose a next step. Jonathan, I mean, if you're willing, you can certainly ask more questions right now to see how we try to get more of the pulse of our specificity on certain things. But if you have the capacity, I think my preference would be just to draft something in accordance with your possible updates that you stated and what you've heard here in this meeting. And I don't know if that would maybe be more effective if staff between now and the next meeting would like to give a once over to the draft to try to homogenize the language with our language, because it might be good to it might make it sit better in the land use regs if they do that.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to help, and sort of whatever process you all and Sue think is going to be the most effective. I'm happy to go with that.
Okay. Yeah, I think it'll be really helpful to see the language and have something real concrete to bounce to give our eyes on.
Yeah, we have sort of a template ordinance or sort of template regulations already that is a good starting point. Obviously, it has to be adjusted for any given place's existing regulations to make it fit in. But yeah, we've got a good starting place.
Okay. I don't think we need to vote on anything. Seems like we're all in agreement to proceed with this. So let's end it there. Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. And we'll be in touch, and we'll see you again.
Thank you all. Looking forward to helping you out with this.
Jonathan, we can be in touch as well.
Sounds good, Sue. You know where to find me.
Okay. The next agenda item is about short-term rentals, and staff did such a good memo and about this, and they provide a little background, but I'll just say to reiterate that I think it was late July at the second land use regs amendment public hearing of the select board. There was, like we often hear at a lot of, meetings or topics about housing, members of the public having concern about the impact of short-term rentals. And that's not to say that members of the select board maybe didn't have concerns either, but what I really got from that is that, they didn't quite give us a direct assignment, but it was, it seemed like they wanted this issue really looked into in a formal way. And so the housing action plan that, that we commissioned a while back had a bit of an analysis on short-term rentals, and I think in this memo, staff, kind of took that and added quite a bit onto it. And so, we can read and interpret and, assign value to that how we want. But I'd like us, my kind of ideal goal is that we send something to the select board. An analysis, an opinion, or some process of action if we feel that's warranted. So I'll leave it there and let staff, if you want to do a summary or just ask questions, or receive questions from commissioners.
I guess the preference would be if you've all read it
Right.
and you want to ask questions, we can go from there. It's pretty, we go over the numbers. Steve did a lot of good research on what's happening elsewhere. We talk a little bit about the different ways that towns are managing short-term rentals. We talk about how we're doing it here in Brattleboro. So we can, you want to direct us to any piece that you want us to summarize, or
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's a good way to do it. How about we just bounce it around? Commissioners, do you have any thoughts or questions? Anything at all?
So the data doesn't include people who are renting units out short-term. That it wouldn't include all of them. It would only include ones that are on like the VRBO, Airbnb type sites, right? Not something like Craigslist, for example.
I don't believe it comes Craigslist. So these are whole homes on the short-term rental platforms. But it could be a whole apartment. It's, it does not capture ones where, I've got a house or I have an apartment and I am short-term renting a room.
I was a little bit unclear on page 2, the second paragraph. It's preceded by saying that in the case of New York City, they figured that 10% of the total rent increases in the city were due to short-term rentals. But then the next paragraph, what the comptroller's report did not seem to focus on, however, is that 90% of the rent price growth in New York City during the 7-year period of study was attributable to anything other than short-term rentals, even in a housing market that was experiencing such dramatic pressure from short-term rentals. Maybe there's just a word I feel like I'm just not processing that paragraph. Is it saying they just didn't give that other 90% much focus, or that they didn't pick it apart?
Essentially, there's just no discussion as to what might be causing that other rent price increase that accounts for 9 times more than the short-term rentals had, and that's certainly a market that was being pressured far more by increases in the amount of short-term rentals and land use conflict with housing than we are here.
Okay.
So if that's the case, even there, it's very unlikely that even 10% of housing price increases here would be attributable to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was curious about what the impetus was for addressing this at this point. It sounds like there's only been one complaint, but has there been something else that kind of has it on your minds right now to pick this up and explore it?
I just kind of like what I was saying, to some degree, the select board is like our bosses. We're volunteers, we're not employees, right? But they're our bosses in a sense. When we were sitting over at that table presenting the land use regs, they were hearing these concerns and comments from the public, like people, like a lot of us have believed or do believe, that the short-term rentals may be having a huge impact.
I had missed that was a directive, so apologies for not having caught that.
Okay. And to some degree, I felt like, we haven't solved the housing issues, and we're not going to just, within the Planning Commission's purview. We're not going to solve everything, but I kind of viewed us maybe moving on to other topics because we've been focusing on housing quite a bit, but it felt like this was, a last kind of unresolved piece, so to speak. So.
Yeah, can I add to that? So, I think it's back before the Planning Commission too. I mean, this would be an opportunity. We kind of explained how we're handling short-term rentals where we don't have it as a defined use in the land use regulations. We do get calls from rental platforms, and the standard response from the zoning administrator is basically, it's kind of a lodging use. You could do it as a home business in certain ways, or do it as a B&B. The Planning Commission might even feel that that is not an interpretation that they, want to recommend making. You might want it more strict. You might want it even looser than that. So it's an opportunity, for the Planning Commission to understand how we're treating it in the office, and think about the ways, and maybe hear from the public. I mean, the public's not here tonight. I think, Tom, we sometimes get questions from the public. We get questions from people who are concerned that maybe a property is changing hands in their neighborhood and they've heard it's going to be a short-term rental. So it's kind of an opportunity to get it out there, get some feedback from the Planning Commission, maybe the public, before you make any recommendations to the select board. Or alternatively, we can pick up on what the short-term rental said, the housing action plan said, and if we think a short-term registry is a good idea, maybe there's a fee, maybe it goes to fund some long-term housing in the community. That's something that the Planning Commission maybe could dig into as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for reiterating those points from the memo. Yeah, there are things that we certainly could weigh in on here. As far as how the planning department has been interpreting it, I think from the memo, correct me if I got this incorrect, Sue, but if it's a standalone short-term rental, then you guys are viewing it as a bed and breakfast or an inn. But if it's within an owner-occupied home, then you're viewing it as a home occupation. And if it's like on a farm or something like that, then you view it as an accessory use, right? Personally, to me, that makes sense. I don't know how other commissioners feel, but I think that was one of the points that you said maybe we could try to seek some different interpretation, or changing language in the land use regs to make it simpler, or because like you're saying, some municipalities just have a category called short-term rentals, and it's like a term and a standard, a set of provisions specifically tailored for this point in time. Yeah. Lindsay.
I guess I was wondering, I feel like usually this conversation is approached from the perspective of wanting to discourage short-term rentals, and I was just wondering if the planning staff or if anyone else had any ideas about whether that's the perspective we should be looking at it from, or whether it's something we would want to encourage. Apparently, we're lagging behind the rest of the county for better or worse. I don't know.
I think that, you know, the housing action plan and even the data that we turned out doesn't indicate to us that this is a growing problem. It is a low percentage of our housing stock. So, you know, whether or not you want to discourage it, I think, you know, that's probably for the Planning Commission and the public to kind of decide. We do think, you know, when a short-term rental platform calls and asks what our regs are, because Airbnb does call and other listing, you know, we think that it might have a chilling effect, that actually you know, that could be a reason that our short-term rentals are on the lower side. But then again, you know, we're also not a resort community. You know, Wilmington and Dover have very, you know, they have higher numbers. At least Dover has higher numbers of Airbnbs that I'm aware of. They also have a lot more of the nuisances that go along with it. We don't seem to have the nuisance that sometimes the resort communities see. So I know I'm not really answering your question. You know, there can be benefits to having a short-term rental. You know, it might help people, you know, stay in the community, keep their homes. So, you know, to what degree you want to be discouraging it, you know.
I'll venture my own personal answer on that as well. I almost feel like, you know, I personally don't even have to make a decision about if short-term rentals are, you know, a problem or a good thing or too much or too little, and if they need regulation, because, you know, the numbers here are that they're making up just between 1 to 1.7% of our housing units, and to the extent that it matches up with the impact that was found in New York City, where for every 1% increase, there's a 1.6% increase in rent prices. I mean, we're looking at, you know, they've maybe had 1.6 to 2% increase, you know, impact on our housing prices increase, and here in Brattleboro, and to me that just doesn't seem significant enough to warrant creating a rental registry and trying to track people down and get them to sign up and enforcing that and charging them for that registry, and spending the time developing it. So yeah, to me that seems to be guiding where I fall on this, more so than even do I think things, you know, housing units should have preference towards owner-occupiers and renters over, you know, long-term renters over short-term, or should it all just be a free-for-all? I feel like I don't even have to find where I come down on that. Dan.
Thanks, Tom. You know, I think I'll give to add to what you're saying, a endorsement of sorts, because the few that I know of are actually on the books of people who are, you might say, you know, flagrantly benefiting from Airbnb and so forth. They're actually, those units are actually subsidizing the overall housing stock in town, and I can elaborate on that. But you know, some of the people who provide long-term housing are also providing short-term housing, and you know, it's for all kinds of reasons, but it's kind of one of those ideas whose time came upon us, you know, and it's certainly, you know, not going away, but I don't think it's a huge problem in town right now myself. And for that matter, I think there is some benefit to having them. But, you know, that's a public perception thing that we're probably not going to get over. So, I guess if I appreciate Steve's work on this to really put some numbers to it.
And back to your point, your question, Lindsay, about discouragement. I think staff is concerned that any regulation might be difficult to enforce for us. So, definitions are usually it's 30 days or nights, not rented for more than 14 days in such and such a period of time, and we don't have the staff to monitor that. There are businesses out there that I think do that kind of thing. I think they're pricey, so, any attempt at, tightening regulations, I think, we'd be concerned about its enforceability.
Lina, do you have any way you'd like to give?
Let me collect my thoughts no longer.
Okay. What do people think of, what do commissioners think of, well, and staff too, of, if we want to give this more time but what do people think of just, staff can certainly do this on their own without our directive, but what do you think of our, recommending that this be sent along to the select board, this memo?
It was very thorough. I think it really explained things well. I appreciated reading it and gave me new information. So I feel like that's worth sharing unless someone can think of, it's already shared. Anyone can look at it, right? So you can't hide it away now, but I don't see any reason not to.
Dan.
Well, I have a question for Steve or Sue. When you're presenting this, being ready to answer questions from the public would be probably, besides the select board members, would you, I suppose, would you think it's advisable to actually use some, sort of projecting some scenarios or we're kind of looking at what is, but I think what the public concern is that this is coming, this is a growing problem. I'm just curious how comfortable you would be with sort of, in addition to what you've already done, sort of, addressing that concern, the projection into the future of what could happen if we do regulate and what could happen if we don't regulate.
I think it might be difficult to do that, just given how
it's definitely difficult. That's why I'm saying, but that might be what they're asking for,
Yeah, there isn't much data, of course. It's really just what we get from that AirDNA site, which I don't even know that that's actually good quality data. Certainly we could always check in periodically on those sites and just take note of how many postings there are and put that in a spreadsheet somewhere and return to it at some point, see if there's a trend line. But I think that there was recently, I could not track this down to include it in the memo, but there was recently a housing economics paper I was reading that was saying there was very good reason to believe that Airbnb and short-term rentals are likely to have a significant decline soon, and a lot of it having to do with this being downstream of interest rates going up. The economics that made that seem like it might pencil, especially in a lot of places that have quite a lot of them, like Nashville, for instance, that those are probably not going to pencil anymore. So if they didn't pencil here anyways, for most people, or they weren't really happening, whether or not they would have been profitable, I don't think there's any reason to think it would be more likely to see them here. But I can certainly try to find that paper and see if there's any applicability.
One of the things I find kind of interesting about this topic is that having lived in a few places that had pretty hot markets for ADUs, or sorry, for short-term rentals, I've seen different ways that people have chosen to regulate, some of which are pretty severe, I think, and some of which are, some of which kind of make sense to me, even though they're restrictive. And one of the things that I found as I was doing a set of case studies of accessory dwelling units in Oregon several years ago is that there were quite a few people who chose to do short-term rental shortly after creating a unit. They did short-term rental first because it was a way to help pay down the costs that they had incurred to create that unit. And in doing so, they were able to have a higher income potential for the period of time they were doing short-term rental. And they also were able to take advantage of it looking really good. Like things look better when they're brand new. And what a lot of people found is that over time, they were exhausted of running a short-term rental. They didn't, most people that I talked to didn't continue running a short-term rental very long. Many of them ended up switching to a long-term rental because it was a lot of work, or because they paid down the debt that they had incurred enough, or that they had some other thing happen, right? For some people, COVID came along and they needed a home office, or for some people, a friend or family member needed a place to stay. So on the one hand, I completely appreciate the moves that cities make in terms of being mindful of not creating a situation in which long-term housing is not available because short-term housing has taken over. And on the other hand, it seems to me that there are a lot of other factors in people's lives that are influencing whether or not they're choosing to do short-term rental with their property, or to do midterm, or to do long-term, or to have a friend or family member using a portion of their property over time. So I personally kind of like there just being flexibility, that people can do what makes the most sense at any given, point in the life cycle of their own, their own life, as well as of their property and their use of it. So, I think that things like having a registry does impact, it's one more hurdle, that impacts people choosing to participate, but it also makes sense that it would be done for the sake of being able to monitor the situation. So I think the registry is kind of the lowest point of regulation. And then there start to be a lot of other things in terms of what is and isn't allowed that I think are more restrictive and start to limit people's potential to do what's going to work for them at any given time. So those are my thoughts, collected or not.
Be collected.
Okay. I guess I'll try making a motion that in light of staff's memo about short-term rentals and discussing it at a planning commission meeting, we don't recommend any action on the topic, and would like the select board to read this memo. Hopefully you can make that sound nicer. More or less those words. Okay. Dan?
I'm sorry, is this time for discussion, or we need to get to the motion first?
We need a second.
We need a second.
Got it. I'll second.
Okay. And discussion?
When this statement or message is sent, would it be Sue and Steve on the hook to be there with the select board, or who's gonna deliver this news?
I didn't envision that we're asking it to be an agenda item at a select board meeting. I just envisioned it would be emailed to them, a correspondence.
That's what I
However,
was thinking.
that's what you were thinking too.
And if they
Sue.
want to have the meeting, we can
If they want
do
to,
that,
yeah.
and we can discuss that.
Yeah, don't need to make a big deal out of it unless they want to. What do others think? Is that, besides potentially better word choice, is that is that motion pretty good, or what do you think? Dan's hand up again.
Well, again, I guess you don't need to say the do not pursue or whatever, but we can table the issue until further notice, or, I don't know it certainly is worth revisiting as a topic. It's an interesting issue. But I think, if there were even a, periodic, check-in about it, that's probably plenty. But in any case, until further notice or something to that effect, like, we may revisit it if it comes up again.
Sounds good to me to add that in there, that no, the planning, that we don't see a reason for any action on the topic at this time. But perhaps.
But always willing to read them.
Yeah, but we're willing to.
But willing to monitor.
Sure. If there's no other comments, Sue, if you could read that back to us before I do a vote.
Okay, I'm gonna try.
Thank you.
In light of staff memo about short-term rentals and discussing it at a planning commission meeting, we don't recommend any action on the topic at this time, but are willing to monitor and revisit as necessary. And we'd like the select board to read the memo. That part seems funny.
Yeah, and
I think that's part of the correspondence. I think we
Exactly.
can probably strike that part, and
Okay.
they're getting the memo as documentation.
it's pretty clear from that. Great. If you could strike that last sentence clause. Okay, stop me, commissioners. If you, Dan.
Well, just a request, if there are questions, I don't know how this message sending, email, of course, but
Me neither.
is it typical smoke signals, right? No, is it typical, Sue, that you would CC Tom on that email to the select board, or how does that work?
I might send it through the town manager's office. I'll probably see how they would like it. But we'll definitely, I will CC Tom in whatever format it takes.
Great. Then my point in asking is, if they were to email a question back, they could ask about this discussion, and Tom could answer them. Yeah.
Okay. Lindsay, was your hand up with a comment?
No, I thought you were gonna ask us if we were good, and I was ready to do
Yeah,
that.
okay. Well, let's do that. All those in favor, please raise your hand and keep it up. It's myself and Dan and Lindsay and Lynna. Okay, that's all four of us. Great. We're moving through this agenda. Okay, on to the next topic. For some of you who may not be aware, every year, I forget which department of the Vermont government, maybe the Agency of Commerce and Commercial Development, offers a municipal planning grant, and we've been winning them quite often and doing a lot of them, almost yearly it seems, while I've been on the commission. But this time there's kind of a different plan for the plan that staff has brought to us. And they shared a memo, but having introduced it that way, I think I'll just leave it for commissioner questions, unless staff wants to jump in with anything that, different than what's on the memo.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. maybe for the public that might be watching this,
Thank you.
as a follow-up, just real briefly, Brattleboro was approached about, to see if we were interested in being involved with a cultural plan for pretty much the Wyndham region. And so the municipal planning grant allows consortium grant applications. And so staff from Wilmington, Rockingham, and Brattleboro have been discussing this. I would say that our planning staff doesn't have capacity to take on another grant. We have the Better Connections grant. However, if we did submit a grant like this, it could be administered through the Wyndham Regional Commission. They have offered to, be a part of that. So really, at the least, we'd have some participation, staff, or possibly the Town Arts Committee. Wouldn't necessarily have to come through the Planning Commission. We would have a small match to make that could come out of the department funding, and we'd just be working with other towns on a cultural plan. The Planning Commission has to approve the application, so that's why it's before the Planning Commission tonight, even though the Planning Commission won't be explicitly involved if we decide to put forth an application.
Do you imagine that there may or will be a steering committee that a commissioner might want to
There
be a
will
part
be a
of?
steering committee. I'm not sure what the membership
Right.
of it would be, but yes. Potentially a planning commissioner could be involved in that. Or somebody from the Town Arts Committee, or
Right.
somebody from the cultural community.
Sure. Yeah. Just maybe for Lindsay's benefit, let's well, I don't know if we need to. I was thinking of giving a little education on past municipal planning grants, but I don't know, it's not necessarily too relevant actually, so I'll just save the time. One can easily go back and look at the different plans that we've done in past years in our Google Drive folder. Yeah, and commissioners' thoughts on this? Can be a one-word thought.
I don't have any thoughts on that.
Okay. Yeah, there's been past years where we've had, maybe one time while I've been on the commission, we've been doing 2 plans at once, plus kind of considering the changes to the land use regs, and it was a little, maybe not overwhelming, but a little too much on our plate. So I think it's totally fine to have, more of a peripheral role, or just a smaller role in one of these plans, assuming that that the consortium wins.
Yeah,
That's
it's
the grant.
kind of an interesting, the state always sets priorities for the municipal planning grants. This is not one of them, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't get funded.
What are some of the priorities this year?
I think it's, town plans are usually a priority. I think flood resiliency, particularly following the July floods, is one of them. Housing.
Yeah, that's a perennial
Yeah.
topic. Okay.
And it's not even we're still waiting on Wilmington as well, to see if they, are both towns, we're all trying to figure out is there support in the planning commission and the select boards, because both boards have to sign off. So
Okay.
may or may not come to fruition, but the first step is to get planning commission consent.
Okay. Well, we can make the motion as stated in the memo, how conveniently, which is to recommend applying as a consortium for a municipal planning grant for a cultural resource plan of the Wyndham region. That's the motion. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
I think Lindsay got in there. Okay, any further discussion before we vote? Going once, going twice, going 3 times? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Myself, Lindsay, Lynna, and Dan. Okay. Well, we have our public comment period. the official public comment period. There's no one hidden there on Zoom? Just 5 participants, okay? No one in the audience here? So if there's no needed closing thoughts or anything, then we're adjourned. And it's Sue's anniversary, so wish her a happy anniversary. And we're giving her a lot of more extra time to celebrate it than she maybe thought she would get.
Dare I ask how many years?
20.
Nice.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great. My sister-in-law just over the weekend celebrated their 14th, but 20. I celebrated my 23rd this summer.
Oh, excellent. Congratulations.
Yeah, but anyway.
Congrats. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, you all
Thank
too.
you.
Good night.